I ran out of gas on Interstate 10 inches Arizona at 2 in the morning in August 2022. It was my own fault. I'd been driving from California to Texas and thought I could make it to the next town. The gas gauge had been hovering near empty for 30 miles, but I convinced myself I'd be fine. I wasn't fine. The engine sputtered and died right there on the highway. No warning, just sudden silence, except for the sound of my car coasting to a stop on the shoulder. I sat there for a moment, processing what happened. Then I checked my phone. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. I was in the middle of the desert between towns, probably 40 miles from anything. The highway was empty. I hadn't seen another car in over 20 minutes. It was just me, the dark road, and miles of desert on both sides stretching endlessly under a moonless sky. I turned on my hazard lights and got out to assess the situation. The heat hit me immediately, even though it was the middle of the night. Desert heat that radiated up from the asphalt, making the air shimmer. I popped the hood and looked at the engine like that would somehow help. I knew nothing about cars. The engine just sat there, a complex mass of metal and hoses that might as well have been alien technology. I decided to wait. Someone would drive by eventually. This was a major interstate. I'd flag them down, ask for help or a ride to the nearest gas station. It seemed simple enough. An hour passed. No cars. The desert was completely silent, except for occasional wind that kicked up small dust devils on the road. I'd never experienced silence like that before. Living in cities my whole life, there was always background noise. Traffic, people, sirens, something. But out there, nothing. Just the vast emptiness pressing in from all sides. I tried my phone again. Still no signal. I thought about walking, but I had no idea how far the next town was. Could be 5 miles, could be 50. Walking in the desert at night without water seemed like a bad idea. I'd read stories about people dying of dehydration trying to walk for help. Another hour passed. Still no cars. I was starting to get worried. The initial annoyance of running out of gas had shifted into something else. A creeping realization that I was truly alone out here, and nobody knew where I was. I'd left LA in a hurry after a fight with my girlfriend. Didn't tell anyone my exact route. My family knew I was driving to Texas, but that was it. If something happened to me, how long before anyone noticed? Days probably, maybe a week. Around 4:30 in the morning, I finally saw headlights. A truck approaching from behind. I jumped out of my car and waved my arms frantically, making sure I was visible in my car's hazard lights. Relief washed over me. Finally, help. The truck slowed down. I could see the driver's silhouette looking at me. Then the truck sped up and drove past me without stopping. I stood there, watching the taillights disappear into the darkness. They'd seen me. They'd definitely seen me clearly, but they hadn't stopped. Hadn't even hesitated beyond that initial slowdown. I got back in my car feeling worse than before. Why wouldn't they stop? Was I that suspicious looking? Or was there another reason not to stop for stranded motorists in the middle of nowhere? Maybe they knew something I didn't about this particular stretch of highway. The sun started coming up, around 6. The temperature climbed fast. I'd drunk all my water hours ago. I had nothing left. The heat inside the car became unbearable, like sitting in an oven. I got out and sat in the small strip of shade next to my car, watching it shrink as the sun rose higher. That's when I noticed the tracks, boot prints in the sand, leading away from my car. They hadn't been there before. I was absolutely sure they hadn't been there before because I'd walked around the car multiple times, checking everything. I walked around my car slowly, studying the ground. The prints started about 10 feet from my passenger side and headed off into the desert toward a cluster of rocks, maybe 50 yards away. Fresh prints. The edges were crisp, hadn't been eroded by wind yet. Made within the last few hours. Someone had been standing near my car while I was inside it, probably while I was asleep during that second hour, when no cars passed and exhaustion had overtaken my anxiety. My heart started pounding. I looked out at the desert but saw nothing, just rocks and scrub brush stretching to the horizon. Whoever made those prints was gone now, or hiding behind those rocks, watching me notice their tracks. I got back in my car and locked the doors, sat there trying to figure out what to do. Someone had approached my car in the middle of the night and just stood there, watching me through the window, then walked away into the desert without trying to wake me or help. What kind of person does that? Around 7, a highway patrol car came by. I'd never been so relieved to see police in my life. The officer gave me a ride to the nearest town and arranged for a tow truck to bring my car in. He was professional and kind, offered me water, which I drank gratefully. While we drove, I mentioned the boot prints to him, asked if there were people who lived out in the desert, if it was common for someone to be walking around out there at night. His expression changed. He glanced at me, then back at the road. He asked me where exactly I'd been parked. I described the location as best I could, mentioning the mile marker I'd noted before my phone died. He nodded slowly and said I was lucky he came along when he did. He told me there'd been incidents along that stretch of highway. People stranded at night reporting someone approaching their vehicles. Strange encounters. A few had gone missing over the years, their vehicles found empty with doors open, belongings still inside. Authorities suspected someone was living out in the desert, watching the highway, targeting people who broke down in isolated areas. They'd searched multiple times but never found anything. The desert was too vast, too many caves and canyons, too many places to hide. He said the unofficial advice among local law enforcement was never to stop on that section of road if you could help it. And if you had to stop, stay in your car with doors locked and wait for police or highway services. Never get out alone. Never accept help from strangers. He asked if I'd seen anyone. I said no, just the prints. He looked relieved and said that was good. The people who'd gone missing, they'd all reported seeing someone standing in the distance before they disappeared, a figure watching them from the rocks or the roadside. We drove in silence after that. I kept thinking about those boot prints, about someone standing next to my car while I slept, watching me through the window, about what would have happened if I'd gotten out while they were there, or if they'd tried the door handles and found them unlocked. The officer dropped me at a gas station in town. Before he left, he handed me his card and said I should consider myself lucky. He'd driven that route many times and found stranded vehicles before, empty vehicles with doors open, belongings still inside, but no driver. They'd just vanished into the desert. Bodies never recovered. I got gas, picked up my car from the tow yard, and continued to Texas. But I couldn't stop thinking about those hours stranded on that dark highway, about the silence, about waking up and finding evidence that someone had been watching me while I slept, about how vulnerable I'd been, and about that truck that saw me and didn't stop. Maybe they knew something I didn't. Maybe they'd driven that road before and knew better than to stop for anyone, no matter how desperate they looked. Maybe they'd seen things. I still don't know who made those boot prints. The officer's theory about someone living in the desert and watching the highway made sense, but was somehow worse than not knowing. The idea that someone was out there, deliberately targeting stranded travelers, waiting in the darkness for people like me to run out of gas at the wrong place at the wrong time, approaching while they slept, watching them. I never drive through that area again if I can help it. And I always make sure my tank is full before driving through empty stretches of highway. Because sometimes being stranded alone isn't the worst thing that can happen. Sometimes there's someone waiting in the darkness for exactly that opportunity. And sometimes you only realize how close you came to disappearing after you've already escaped. I got stuck on a ski lift alone at a resort in Vermont in January 2023. The lift stopped working with me halfway up the mountain. It was near closing time. The sun was setting, and I was the only person on that particular lift. I'd been skiing all day and decided to do one final run. Most people had already headed down. The lifts were still running, but the mountain was emptying out fast. The parking lot was half empty when I'd looked down from my last run. I got on the chair by myself, thinking I'd be at the top in 10 minutes. One more run down my favorite trail, then I'd call it a day. About 3 minutes into the ride, the lift jolted to a stop. The sudden halt made the chair swing violently. I hung there, suspended 40 feet above the ground, swaying slightly in the wind. I figured it was a temporary stoppage. It happens sometimes. Someone probably fell getting off at the top. They'd restart it in a minute. A minute passed, then 5 minutes. The lift didn't restart. I looked down and saw the lift operators at the base station had left their posts. The little heated booth where they usually stood was dark and empty. The area below was completely deserted. I tried to stay calm. They knew I was up here. They had to know. They'd restart the lift soon. But the sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping fast. I was dressed for skiing, not for sitting still in freezing temperatures. My jacket was meant to keep you warm while moving, not while suspended motionless in increasingly bitter cold. Another 10 minutes passed. The light was fading rapidly now. I could see the main lodge in the distance. Lights on, people inside probably having drinks and warming up by the fireplace. But I was stuck out here in the growing darkness, the distance between us feeling insurmountable. I started yelling, calling for help as loud as I could. My voice echoed across the mountain, but nobody responded. The resort was large, and I was on one of the farther lifts, one of the less popular ones that accessed expert terrain. The wind carried my voice away into the darkening forest below. By now it had been 30 minutes. The sun was completely down. The temperature had to be in the teens and falling. My fingers were going numb even in my gloves. I kept moving my feet and hands to maintain circulation, flexing and wiggling everything I could, but the cold was seeping in deeper with every passing minute. I thought about jumping. I looked down at the ground below, 40 feet, snow-covered, but with rocks and tree stumps visible poking through in places. Even landing in deep snow from that height would probably break bones. Definitely break bones. And then I'd be injured and alone in the cold at night. That seemed worse than staying on the lift. At least up here I was in one piece. An hour passed. It was fully dark now. The lift chair was swaying more in the wind, which had picked up significantly. Each gust made the chair rock and creak. I was shivering uncontrollably, my whole body trembling. I'd stopped being able to feel my feet. They were just numb lumps at the end of my legs. I tried my phone repeatedly. No signal up on the mountain, just the emergency call screen mocking me. I thought about the emergency protocols. The resort would do a final sweep before closing. They'd see the lift was stopped. They'd come check. They had to. It was basic safety procedure. But what if they didn't? What if everyone assumed someone else had checked? What if I'd been overlooked in the end-of-day rush? What if all the employees were already home, thinking everything had been shut down properly? I started thinking about how long someone could survive in these temperatures. I knew about hypothermia, about how it made you tired and confused first, about how people froze to death by falling asleep in the cold, their bodies just shutting down. I forced myself to stay awake and keep moving what I could move, wiggling my toes even though I couldn't feel them anymore, flexing my fingers inside my gloves, singing songs to keep my mind active, though my voice was weak and my jaw was stiff with cold. Anything to stay conscious. Another hour passed. 2 hours total now. I couldn't feel most of my body. My thoughts were getting fuzzy, disconnected. The shivering had stopped, which I knew was a very bad sign. That meant my core temperature had dropped so low my body had given up trying to generate heat. That was the stage right before you died. I saw lights in the distance. Snowmobiles moving across the base of the mountain. I tried to yell, but my voice was weak, barely a whisper. My throat was raw from earlier shouting. They were far away, probably patrol doing a final check of different areas. They couldn't hear me. I watched them helplessly. I watched the lights disappear behind a ridge. I wanted to cry, but couldn't tell if tears would even form in this cold. My face was completely numb. I'd lost track of time. Everything was numb. I was so tired. I knew I shouldn't sleep, but I couldn't keep my eyes open. The darkness was overwhelming, and the cold had seeped so deep into my body that I couldn't fight it anymore. My head kept dropping forward. I heard something. An engine. Distant at first, then closer. I tried to open my eyes. Snowmobile lights coming toward me, cutting through the darkness. Someone was shouting my name. How did they know my name? The next thing I remember clearly was being in the patrol station wrapped in blankets. Multiple blankets piled on top of me. Someone was checking my vitals, pressing a stethoscope to my chest. People were talking in stressed voices around me. I caught fragments of conversation, core temperature, frostbite, lucky to be alive. The patrol leader, a woman in her 40s, explained what happened once I was more coherent. There'd been a mechanical failure with the lift. The operator at the base had shut it down for safety, but failed to check if anyone was still on it before leaving for a day. Standard protocol was to verify the lift was empty, to count the chairs going past and make sure nobody was still riding. But the operator had been in a hurry, eager to get home, and had forgotten, just completely forgotten that critical step. They'd only realized when doing final checks before officially closing the mountain for the night. They'd counted the chairs and realized one had a person on it. They'd sent patrol immediately, but it had taken time to locate exactly where I was on the long lift line, to get the snowmobiles up there. I'd been stuck up there for just over 2 hours. My core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Another 20 or 30 minutes, and I might not have made it. The patrol leader said that matter-of-factly, but I could see the concern in her eyes. They called an ambulance. I spent the night in the hospital, being treated for hypothermia and frostbite on my toes. 3 toes on my left foot and 2 on my right had significant damage. Nothing permanent, thankfully, but I was lucky. Another hour and I might have lost them entirely. The resort was apologetic, very apologetic. Offered compensation, free season passes, anything I wanted. Promised the employee would be retrained, and new protocols would be put in place to prevent this from ever happening again. But none of that changed what happened. I'd been forgotten up on that mountain, left alone in the dark and cold to slowly freeze while people went home to their warm houses. The worst part wasn't the cold or the fear. It was the realization of how easily someone could be forgotten, how a simple oversight could be fatal, how being alone in a situation where you're supposed to be safe and monitored could turn deadly because someone didn't follow protocol, because someone was tired or distracted or just didn't care enough to double check. I haven't been skiing since. I can't bring myself to get on a lift. The memory of hanging there in the dark, feeling my body shut down, watching the lights of the lodge and knowing people were inside warm and safe while I was slowly freezing, that stays with you. The helplessness of it. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if the patrol hadn't done that final check. If they'd assumed the lift was empty, like the operator said. If they'd all gone home thinking everything was secure, I'd have been up there all night. They would have found me in the morning, frozen solid, still sitting in that chair. Being stranded alone on that lift taught me something. Safety measures and protocols only work if people follow them. And sometimes, you're completely at the mercy of whether someone does their job correctly. That night, someone didn't, and I almost died because of it, because I was alone and forgotten on a dark mountain while the world below moved on without me. I got separated from my hiking group in a cave system in Kentucky in September 2021. We were doing a guided tour of an unmapped section, one of those adventure tours for experienced cavers. There were 6 of us plus the guide. I was taking photos near the back of the group when I noticed a side passage I wanted to capture. The rock formations looked interesting in my headlamp beam. I stepped into it for maybe 30 seconds to get a better angle on the formations. When I turned back, the group was gone. I could hear their voices echoing somewhere, but I couldn't tell which direction. The acoustics in caves are incredibly disorienting. Sounds bounce off walls and seem to come from everywhere at once. What sounds close might be far away and vice versa. I called out. My voice echoed back at me multiple times, but nobody responded. The echoes made it sound like several people were calling back, but it was just my own voice bouncing around. I walked back to where I thought the main passage was, but the tunnel split into 3 directions. I had absolutely no idea which one the group had taken. I picked the middle path and walked for about 5 minutes, calling out occasionally. The passage narrowed steadily. I had to crouch, then crawl. My headlamp illuminated rough stone walls, pressing in on both sides. I started to panic. This didn't look familiar at all. We hadn't crawled through anything this tight. I turned back and retraced my steps carefully. Found the split again. Tried the left passage this time. It opened into a larger chamber maybe 30 feet across. Empty. No sign of the group. Multiple tunnels led out of the chamber in different directions. I counted 5 separate passages. I had no idea which one to take. That's when I realized how serious this was. I was alone in an unmapped cave system with limited light. My headlamp had maybe 2 hours of battery left if I was lucky. I had no food, limited water in a small bottle, and no idea how to get out. I tried to stay calm. I sat down in the chamber and thought about what to do. The guide would notice I was missing. They'd come back for me. I just needed to stay where I was and wait. That was basic survival protocol when lost. Stay put. But time passed and nobody came. I checked my phone. No signal, obviously. Solid rock all around blocked any signal. The time showed I'd been separated for almost an hour. How had an hour passed already? It felt like maybe 15 minutes. I decided I couldn't just sit there indefinitely. I had to try to find my way out. I picked the largest tunnel leading out of the chamber. It sloped upward, which seemed promising. Up meant toward the surface, hopefully. The tunnel went on for a long time, twisting and turning constantly. Sometimes I had to squeeze through narrow sections, where the walls seemed to grab at my clothes. The walls were damp and cold. Water dripped from somewhere ahead, the sound echoing eerily. I reached another chamber. This one had a small underground pool of perfectly still water. The water was crystal clear. I could see the bottom maybe 10 feet down, covered in smooth white stones. The chamber had 4 exits. I had no idea which way to go. Each looked equally possible. I was starting to feel the weight of the stone above me. Thousands of tons of rock between me and the surface. If I got truly lost, if I couldn't find my way out, nobody would find me down here. Not in unmapped passages. I'd just disappear into the earth. My family would never know what happened to me. My headlamp flickered. Battery warning. I turned it off to conserve power and sat in complete darkness. The kind of darkness that doesn't exist above ground. Absolute darkness where you can't see your hand even if you press it against your face. I'd never experienced anything like it. The darkness was so complete it felt physical, like it was pressing against me, suffocating me. I could hear my breathing, my heartbeat, the drip of water somewhere distant. That was all. No visual reference points, no way to orient myself, just the void. I turned the headlamp back on after maybe 2 minutes. I couldn't handle the darkness. I'd rather risk running out of battery than sit in that void. The darkness felt like it was swallowing me. I picked another tunnel at random. This one was smaller, barely wide enough to fit through. I had to take off my backpack and push it ahead of me. The walls scraped against my shoulders. The ceiling brushed the top of my head. I tried not to think about the tunnel getting narrower, about getting stuck. The tunnel opened into a narrow vertical shaft. I shined my light up but couldn't see the top. The shaft went up into darkness. I shined it down and saw the shaft dropped into darkness below. There was a ledge running along one wall, maybe 18 inches wide, very narrow. I had to decide, go back through that tight passage or try the ledge. Going back meant admitting I was hopelessly lost and would probably die down here. The ledge might lead somewhere. It might lead to a way out. I stepped onto the ledge carefully. The stone was slick with moisture. I pressed my back against the wall and shuffled sideways. The shaft dropped away to my right. I couldn't see the bottom even with my headlamp beam. Halfway across, my foot slipped on wet stone. For one horrible second I was falling. My stomach lurched. I grabbed desperately at the wall, my fingers finding a small crack. I held on with everything I had, my feet scrabbling for purchase on the ledge. My backpack slipped off my shoulder and tumbled into the darkness. I heard it hit something far below after several long seconds. That could have been me. I pressed myself against the wall, breathing hard, my heart hammering. I'd almost fallen, almost died right there in that shaft. Nobody would have found me at the bottom. Nobody even knew I was in this part of the cave system. I made it to the other side eventually, every movement careful and deliberate. Another tunnel. This one felt different somehow. The air was moving slightly. I could feel a faint breeze on my face. Moving air might mean a way out. I followed the tunnel. It sloped upwards steeply. I had to use my hands to climb in places, pulling myself up over rock ledges. My headlamp was dimming noticeably now. Battery almost gone. The light was getting yellower. The tunnel opened into a large cavern, maybe the size of a small house, and I saw light. Not headlamp light, natural light, dim and distant but unmistakable, grey daylight filtering in from somewhere. The most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I stumbled toward the light, exhausted and dehydrated but energized by hope, found a narrow crack in the cavern wall, squeezed through, scraping my arms. On the other side was a steep slope of loose rocks leading up toward a hole in the ceiling. Sky visible beyond the hole, actual sky. I climbed desperately. The rocks shifted under my feet and hands. Some tumbled away down the slope. I was exhausted, dehydrated, terrified, but I climbed. I pulled myself up, rock by rock. I pulled myself out through the hole and collapsed on the ground. Forest, trees, sky. The sun was setting, but I was out. I was on the surface. I lay there for several minutes, just breathing clean air and feeling the breeze on my face. I had no idea where I was. The cave entrance we'd gone in was nowhere in sight. I'd come out a completely different opening, probably miles away through the underground system. I walked until I found a road, maybe 2 miles through the forest, flagged down a car. The driver was concerned about my appearance. Muddy, scraped up, bleeding in places, clearly in distress. They drove me to the nearest town without asking too many questions. The police contacted the cave rescue team. They'd been searching for me for 6 hours. The guide had reported me missing as soon as they realized I wasn't with the group. They'd searched the passages they'd covered but couldn't find me. I'd gone too deep into unmapped territory. They were preparing for a full rescue operation involving multiple teams. I'd been underground and lost for almost 8 hours. I'd wandered through unmapped passages, nearly fallen to my death in a shaft, lost my supplies, and somehow found a way out through pure luck. The cave rescue coordinator told me I was incredibly fortunate. People got lost in cave systems and died regularly. The fact that I'd found natural light and a way out was miraculous. Most people in my situation would have died down there, either from falling, hypothermia, or dehydration. I never went caving again. The memory of that darkness, the feeling of being surrounded by stone, the knowledge that I'd been separated from the world above by hundreds of feet of rock with no clear path back. That's not something I want to experience again. The helplessness of being lost in those passages, not knowing if any tunnel would lead out or just deeper into the earth. Being stranded alone in those caves taught me how fragile our connection to the surface is, how quickly you can slip from the known world into some place where nobody can find you, where you're truly and completely alone with just the darkness and the stone and your own failing light. I got lucky. I found that crack in the cavern, that glimpse of daylight. But I think about how easily I could have taken a different tunnel, how easily I could have missed that light and wandered deeper into the system, and how I'd still be down there if I had, lost in the darkness forever, another person who went into the earth and never came back.